welcome to the Policy Center for the New South. I am today delighted to be joined by Dr. Ousmane Badiane, who is the Executive Chairperson of AKADEMIYA2063. Dr. Ousmane, thank you very much for accepting the invitation.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Today we will be discussing Africa's bioeconomy agendas, and I want to start with you with the Paris Agreement's implementation. So far, where do we stand with aligning policies in Africa to meet the Paris Agreement so far?
Thank you. This is a very important question. Thinking about climate change, the exposure of African economies, the vulnerability, and how we're already seeing some of those major threats and crises across the globe, but certainly in Africa as well. African countries actually have been doing their best to respond to the Paris Agreement. Practically all African countries have prepared NDCs, nationally determined commitments, to respond to the Paris Agreement and implement the Paris Agreement. Many of them have in their NDCs their adaptation plans, or separately to that, they have put together their own adaptation plans. So the willingness and understanding of the threat and basically willingness to respond to it is there. Doesn't mean that the means are there to respond and respond effectively. But the first and necessary groundwork has been done in terms of being aware of it, taking it seriously, and stepping up and trying to respond to it. Now, of course, from the NDCs and the NAPs, we are a long way from getting things done on the ground. We are currently at AKADEMIYA2063 working with countries to try and elucidate the ambitions and aspirations in the NDCs and NAPs to make sure that they are measurable, trackable, but also that they are put into packages that can be implemented, investment programs that can be funded so they can deal with climate change. It involves quite a lot. In most countries, you will have an NDC and an NAP, but then you'll also have a climate change strategy. You'll have an initiative for this and that. You have a policy for resilience. So you have a plethora of all these different policy and strategy documents that have to be brought together in a consistent way. So the first starting point for many African countries to really deal effectively with the Paris Agreement is to look at that entire environment across ministries and governments to respond to the climate change and bring it into one coherent framework. You don't have to merge the policies, but at least have a common results framework that everybody can refer to. We're working with countries to do that, but also after you have this kind of results framework, it becomes very clear that the different work streams around climate are not always converging. There are some trade-offs. They need to be understood. The example is if you want to slow down your rate of deforestation, but you've been expanding agricultural land to boost productivity over the years. So what will give, right? Will you reduce productivity in agricultural land, or will you go into intensification to get more out of existing land? So you need to bring those two into balance as you move forward. But also, you need to understand your future trajectory. Climate change is a future issue. So what are your mitigation pathways? What are your adaptation pathways that are consistent with your development ambitions? So it's a more of a complex issues that countries are struggling with. We haven't even spoken about the finance issues as well. So countries are ready, that's the bottom line, ready in terms of willingness to confront the issue of climate change. But the institutional infrastructure, the policy understanding, the financial planning and implementation capacities need to be developed as we go forward.
And quickly, are there any countries who are performing well while aligning their NDCs and implementing the climate change adaptation plans like regarding to others, or?
You know, my job often is to rank countries. We have a whole program that just does that when we look at it. But no two countries are really alike. Right? So the most important thing when it comes to the Paris Agreement is the large number of African countries, practically all except maybe one, that have already stepped up to the plate, put together the NDCs and NAPs and are willing to move. They're moving at different speeds, each of them based on their capabilities. But I think the awareness is there and the willingness to do something is there as well.
Perfect. I want to move on to the COP28 outcomes. In light of the discussions at the COP, what specific commitments have African nations made regarding climate finance for sustainable agri-food systems, and how do these commitments address the unique challenges faced by the continent?
You know, climate finance is basically financing development moving forward. It's not one thing that you solve, right? It's the entire economy. If you look at African countries, climate change is rocking our economies through its impact in agriculture. Okay, 80% of the macroeconomic shocks coming from climate change work through the agricultural sector. But luckily for us, there's also the sector where we contribute the most to climate change. So that gives us the opportunity for a win-win, basically, right? While you're mitigating, you can also be adapting. There are very few sectors where you can do that, but you can do it in agriculture. So what climate finance should do for us in Africa to help us to position our food systems, our agricultural sectors, not just to withstand the effects of climate change in the future, but also to reduce emissions as we go. And that's not just one project, one program to finance. Is the gross process itself, the financing of that package, given the size of agriculture in the economies that we need to look at. And there's a huge gap. Climate finance in general, people estimate the gaps between $200 and $400 billion. Most of it was supposed to go to African countries. Africa alone, people say, needs an additional $250 billion a year by 2030. So these are huge amount of money. And if you look at the infrastructure for climate finance, almost very little goes to adaptation. It's mostly mitigation. But as I said, for Africa, mitigation and adaptation are poorly separable because it is through agriculture where we need to adapt that we're also being disrupted the most from climate change. African countries are doing their best, but I think fairness and justice will require that the global community foots also part of the bill. We have not contributed to climate change to the extent that we're being damaged by climate change. And I would like to see climate finance in Africa discussed jointly with the issue of loss and damage. And there was a breakthrough, kind of, in Dubai. And I hope that people will look at what could be done. African forest resources could be valued. I'm sure it will probably generate billions of dollars, contributing to greenhouse gas sink, contributing to mitigating global warming. And that's a service to the global community. We're not even talking about the loss and damage, but just a service we're providing to the global community. Starting by putting a value to forest resources, putting a value to reforestation efforts, will generate the resources Africa need to finance its adaptation agenda and contribute to the climate agenda. So African countries are doing what they can, but I think fairness and justice require that the global community step up to the plate and help correct the wrongs that Africa has been subjected to and provide the finance to redress what we think is wrong. Again, the loss and damage agreement seems to be pointing in the right direction. The challenge for African countries now is to go and have fundable investment programs for adaptation and mitigation that could be supported by the global community.
All right. Let's move to bioeconomy development in the continent. What successful examples exist of integrating bioeconomy principles into national agricultural policies in Africa? And how do these can be scaled to enhance food security and resilience across the continent?
The issue of bioeconomy is new globally and certainly new in Africa as well. There are a few countries that are pioneering this new way of thinking about development. Countries like South Africa, like Namibia, Uganda recently, I think, had a bioeconomy strategy. or the East African community also have the first regional bioeconomy strategy. Bioeconomy itself is a new way of looking at things and a new way of approaching development. So outside of Namibia and South Africa, countries have not yet embraced bioeconomy. And that's the reason why this conference, organized by AKADEMIYA2063 in partnership with the Policy Center for the New South, is raising awareness, but also showing the opportunities around bioeconomy. Beyond the strategy, bioeconomy is a new way of doing business, a new way about thinking about doing business. It requires the science and technology infrastructure to innovate for new products and processes. It requires the partnership with the private sector to invest in these new areas. It requires the skills to be developed to be able to support these new production processes and new products, right? So that is going to be a trajectory. I think outside of Namibia in the area of biomass, and South Africa a little bit more in pharmaceuticals and other things, the opportunities of bioeconomy have not been embraced by most African countries. But I think now is the time to start to think about it seriously.
Okay, I want to see this opportunity to discuss with you the implementation of renewable energy in food systems and how it can transform food systems. How can renewable energy solutions be effectively incorporated in Africa's agri-food systems to mitigate the impacts of climate change?
Thank you very much. That is another important question. Africa's development ambitions cannot be realized without increased energy consumption. And if you want to combine that with ambitions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then African countries need to embrace and invest heavily and at scale in renewables. Solar energy, wind are certainly some of those most promising, but also dams and other things that could allow us to get to renewable energy. Even green hydrogen actually is a place where Africa should also think about investing. What renewables allow us to do is to free us from the grid and give us the opportunity to have a much more fair and inclusive energy policy. To bring into the energy systems and ecosystems, the rural areas, the marginalized areas, but also to tailor energy infrastructure to energy needs at the community level and to service remote areas. Here the question that we are facing in Africa is, how do we reduce emission intensity or energy intensity as we grow? Granted, the overall level of energy use is going to be increasing in aggregate terms, but how much of that energy consumption is polluting per unit of GDP has to be brought down. So it's a little bit of a complex approach to this. Our energy bill, energy consumption has to be thought in terms of energy intensity per every kilogram of food that's produced, or every franc or euro or dollar GDP.
Where do we stand about these discussions so far?
There are a lot of efforts across the continent in this. Hydropower, but also solar power. Morocco has its own ambitions here. You look at Senegal, a big chunk of the energy currently is coming from solar. Most African countries have the type of solar radiation that give them a huge potential to develop solar power. The manufacturing that goes with it has to come to Africa as well, of solar panel and improved solar panels and other things. So countries are doing what they can to move this agenda. And I know that a country that's just discovered gas and oil like Senegal is ramping up its solar capacity. And that is the way that we have to go in the future. What's important here is for us to also embrace other types of renewable or more sustainable energy. Africa has a lot of lithium, battery, electric vehicle, and so on. What I thought could be a first step in that direction is to have a gradual approach. Currently, hybrid cars could help Africa divide by 2 its consumption of fossil fuel. We're not even talking about electric cars because it's going to take a while to get the infrastructure for the recharging and other things. But right now, available hybrid car, not electro-hybrid, but hybrid cars where basically the car itself is recharging its battery, you don't need to plug the car, is available for savings of about 50% of fossil fuel. And I think when we talk about helping Africa with energy transition, linking it to loss and damage and other things, but also mitigation commitments, helping African countries transition from full gas-powered cars to hybrid cars will already immediately, within a very, very short time span, reduce fuel consumption in Africa by 30 to 40%, which is huge as you move forward and then build the infrastructure for EVs and other things. So there are things we can do, but we have to accept gradualism. Right? We cannot just go and say, move all these things aside. We have to move towards reducing the energy intensity of every additional dollar in the next few years while we're developing the renewables.
Dr. Ousmane, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us and with our audience. Thank you very much for following this episode. Stay tuned for more insightful episodes at the Policy Center for the New South. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
All right, bye-bye.